Hey guys, welcome back. In this video I'm going to be fixing up an old broken surfboard. So my friend from college gave this board to me because he bought it really cheap. It wasn't rideable at the time and he said if I could fix it up I could have it. So my first attempt, I bought marine epoxy and just filled in the cracks, and it worked, but it just looks like crap and it doesn't really ride that well because I didn't smooth any of it out. So for my second attempt I'm gonna cut off the tail and replace it with wood. And just a quick disclaimer, I wouldn't recommend doing this to a functioning surfboard just because I had no experience and I was kind of making this up as I was going on. I did do a little research and had a fiberglass surfboard, so some of the techniques can be useful in repairing cracks and stuff like that, but I wouldn't recommend cutting the tail of your surfboard off. The inside foam is very soft, so I would cut away most of the material with the saw, and then I took a block with some sandpaper, I think it was 100 grit sandpaper, and I would sand it right up to the line and get it really nice and smooth. And I went ahead and cut the nose off too, just because I thought it would look better. So I cut up cedar, walnut, and maple just because the colors would contrast each other. Then I went ahead and glued it all up. The next day I took it to the sander, got most of the pieces pretty much flat. I used my bevel gauge to find the angle of the cuts I made on the surfboard, and then I took that to my miter gauge on my table saw and matched the angle. It wasn't that I needed to find the correct angle, it was more of matching the angle and then replicating it on the table saw. Since the angle was going to be pretty hard to clamp up, I decided to put a dowel in it because it'll add strength to the joint and it'll make it easier to clamp. And I did the same process for the opposite piece on the other side. After that was all dry, I used the offcuts of foam to mark out the general shape of the tail, and then I took it to the bandsaw and cut out basically the shape of that. I left a lot of material on the outside so I could go back and hand sand it and refine it to its final shape. I also glued in two dowels to the bottom piece of the wood, and they extend into two holes that I'll drill into the back of the surfboard, and that'll add strength to the joint to when I epoxy the wood to the surfboard. After widening the holes with the drill and doing some hand sanding, you can see how it all fits in. I knocked off most of the material on the belt sander, and then I used a file to really refine the shape. And I spent a lot of time trying to match the original curvature of the board and get the tail really symmetrical. Then I did the same process on shaping the nose. I epoxied 2 nails into the holes I just drilled, cut off the heads, and then I pushed the nails into the foam of the surfboard. I didn't have to drill a pilot hole into the foam this time because they were small enough. And then I just used masking tape to hold it in place while the epoxy dried. Gluing on the tail was a little more complicated because I needed to use clamps and I needed to use a filler to thicken the 2-part epoxy that I used. You could buy specially made epoxy fillers, but I didn't really want to spend any more money at this point. So I did a little research and found out that you could use salt or sugar to thicken up the epoxy. And after thinking about it for a little bit, I didn't really want to use salt because it's a corrosive material, and I didn't know how that would react with the wood and the fiberglass and everything, so I went with sugar, and it actually worked out really well. I let it sit for about a day, and after it was fully dry, I pulled the wood trying to see if I could pull it apart from the board just as a strength test, and I couldn't pull it apart. I was pretty amazed how strong it was. The sugar didn't affect the strength at all of the joint, so I was pretty happy with it. The technique to fiberglassing is that you lay the fiberglass on top of the board, pour the resin on top of the fiberglass, and then spread it around using a brush or a squeegee. And to avoid having the fiberglass dry with bumps and wrinkles, try to keep the fiberglass close to the board as it sets up. I'm just using fiberglass that I bought at the Home Depot, but for a better quality finish and a smoother finish, you should look into buying fiberglass specifically made for surfboards. And just to touch on the safety, I would always recommend wearing a respirator when you're mixing up the epoxy, but more importantly when you're sanding it, just because you don't want any of the particles of the fiberglass to get in your lungs. And I would also recommend wearing gloves because the fiberglass gets really itchy if you work with it for a long period of time. Once one side was completely dry, and after I cut away the excess material off, I sanded it, got it really nice and smooth, flipped the board over, and did the exact same process on the other side of the board. After both sides of the board were fiberglassed, I sanded up to 220 grit just to smooth out any of the imperfections, and then I put on the final coat of epoxy. This coat is called the hot coat, and it just helps transition the new fiberglass into the old fiberglass and helps smooth everything out. After that dried, I sanded with 400 grit sandpaper really lightly and put in the fins and got it ready to ride. Going into this project, I had really low expectations. I thought I was just going to destroy the board and wind up buying a new one. But that wasn't the case. I actually really like how the wood looks in the board, and I don't think it made the board any worse than it actually was, so I'm really happy how it came out. And plus it's cool to give a second life to what was pretty much trash. I hope you guys liked the project. If you did, give me a thumbs up, please subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Thanks for watching.